For the first time since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 in February, the streets of Kyiv, Lviv, Dnipro and Odessa echoed not with the sound of war but of dissent, not anti-Russian protests but anti-government protests. Thousands of Ukrainians gathered outside the presidential office. There were no rioters, nor Kremlin stooges, nor malcontents, but citizens, for the most part I think. Citizens outraged by President Zelensky's decision to sign into law a bill that many believe guts Ukraine's anti-corruption infrastructure. So to begin with the legislation itself, the bill grants sweeping authority to the Prosecutor General, a presidential appointee, over two key watchdogs, NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and SAPO, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. This means the Prosecutor General can now issue binding instructions to NABU, access all its case files, transfer or even terminate investigations. In other words, institutions once celebrated as independent are now tethered to the executive. And it's the most significant centralization of judicial power in Ukraine since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. The reaction has been swift and furious. In Kyiv, over 1,000 protesters gathered late on Tuesday, with signs reading, "We chose Europe, not autocracy, and my father didn't die for this." In Lviv and Dnipro, similar chants of veto the law and shame rang out. Veterans, some with visible war wounds, stood side by side with students and anti-corruption campaigners. For many, this was not about procedure but betrayal, and the law violated what some called the wartime social contract, the quiet understanding that civil society would support the state so long as the state upheld basic democratic principles, and that contract looks as if it may have been broken. Zelensky has defended the move, and in his words, the anti-corruption bodies needed to be cleansed of Russian influence. He's accused NABU of slow-walking high-profile cases and allowing corruption to fester. Now, actually, I've been talking to people today, and that seems a perfectly reasonable statement. He cited alleged collusion between NABU agents and Russian intelligence, accusations that remain largely unsubstantiated. But critics, including NABU itself, argue that the arrests and raids that have taken place in the last few days were a smokescreen for neutering institutional checks on the presidency. The outcry has not stopped at Ukraine's borders. EU Enlargement Commissioner Marta Kos called the law a serious step back. The German Foreign Ministry warned that Ukraine's path to EU membership is hampered. G7 ambassadors and Transparency International Ukraine condemned the dismantling of independent oversight, and even the OECD wrote to the President's office warning of consequences for investment and reconstruction funding. It's worth repeating. The creation of NABU and SAPO was a condition of Western aid after 2014, and undoing them imperils not just EU accession, but the trust of Ukraine's allies. What is truly at stake here is not simply governance, it's Ukraine's credibility. Its moral authority as a nation fighting not only for territory but for values. And if Ukraine defeats Russia on the battlefield only to mimic its internal authoritarianism, then the victory risks becoming hollow. As one protester said, we're beginning to look like Russia, just with different colours. Opposition MPs are attempting to repeal the law. Some are lobbying Brussels and Washington to exert pressure. The Constitutional Court may yet be petitioned, but few believe the law will be rolled back without sustained international intervention and domestic outrage. Zelensky has rightly earned admiration as a wartime leader, but democracies must be defended not only at the front lines but in legislation, in institutions, and in streets full of ordinary people who refuse to be silenced. I think the immediate assumptions by people who are condemning this law may need to be revised over the next few days as more details emerge, or if they emerge at all. But I think the idea that, just as with the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, there is compromise from Russia. We know that Russia is exerting power all over the place. We know that there's a huge effort by the Russian Secret Service. This is not an impossible conclusion. The question is whether or not there's a time limit on this legal restriction. If Ukraine is to join the European family, it must choose transparency over control, justice over convenience, and trust over centralization, because in the end, it's not tanks or treaties that sustain a nation, It's the conscience of Ukraine that sustains a nation and that will sustain Ukraine. It's the conscience of Ukraine.